Gloucester, England, February 24, 1994. A cold, gray winter day in a city that traces its history back to Roman times. Gloucester sits in the southwest of England, about 100 miles west of London, a market town that had grown into a modest city while retaining much of its historic character. The cathedral, with its soaring Gothic architecture, dominated the skyline. The River Severn wound through the landscape. And on the residential streets, rows of Victorian terraced houses stood as they had for more than a century. One of those houses was 25 Cromwell Street, an unremarkable three-story terraced house in a working-class neighborhood. The house had been home to Fred and Rose West and their children for more than 2 decades. To neighbors, the Wests were an odd couple. Fred was a laborer and handyman, often seen working on his house or fixing cars. Rose was younger, heavyset, and reportedly worked as a prostitute from the home. The house was always busy, with children coming and going, lodgers renting rooms, and a constant stream of visitors. But on this February morning, 25 Cromwell Street was surrounded by police vehicles. Officers from the Gloucestershire Constabulary had arrived with a search warrant. They were looking for the remains of Heather West, Fred and Rose's 16-year-old daughter who had disappeared in 1987. For years, Fred and Rose had told people that Heather had run away, that she had gone to work in the Midlands or had become a drug addict. But Heather's siblings had always found this story suspicious. Heather had been close to some of her brothers and sisters. She had talked about her plans, her hopes for the future. And then, suddenly, she was gone with no contact, no letters, no phone calls. When Heather's younger sister, Louise, had asked about her, Fred had made a chilling joke. "Heather's under the patio, darling. I'll dig her up if you don't shut up." Everyone had assumed it was Fred's dark sense of humor, but Louise had never forgotten the comment. And as she grew older, she began to wonder if there was truth behind the joke. In August 1992, Louise went to the police. She told them about her sister's disappearance, about her father's disturbing comment, about the sexual abuse that had occurred in the West household. The police took her statement, but initially, there was insufficient evidence to act on her claims. But Detective Constable Hazel Savage, a tenacious and experienced officer, was not satisfied. She continued to investigate, building a case piece by piece. She interviewed family members, former lodgers, and neighbors. She researched missing persons reports, and she became convinced that Heather West had not run away, she had been murdered. In February 1994, armed with new evidence and testimony, Savage obtained a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street. The warrant authorized the police to search for human remains, specifically those of Heather West. On February 24, police arrived at the house with ground-penetrating radar equipment and a forensic team. Fred West, now 52 years old, answered the door. He was a small, wiry man with receding hair and a distinctive West Country accent. He seemed nervous but cooperative as police explained they would be searching the property. Rose West, 40 years old, heavyset with dark hair, watched from inside the house. She appeared angry and defensive, demanding to know why the police were targeting her family. The search began in the garden, where Fred had built a patio years earlier. Officers used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area beneath the concrete slabs. The readings suggested anomalies, potential voids, or disturbed earth. The team began to excavate. Within hours, they found bones, human bones, a skull, femurs, ribs. The remains were shallow, buried just a few feet beneath the patio. Fred West had been telling a version of the truth. Heather was under the patio. Fred was immediately arrested. He was taken to the police station and placed in custody. As officers continued to search the garden, they found more bones. And then, as they expanded their search to the cellar beneath the house, they made another discovery. More remains, and then more. Over the following days and weeks, the excavation of 25 Cromwell Street would uncover a horror beyond anything the investigators had imagined. The house was not just the site of one murder. It was a burial ground, a charnel house, a place where young women and girls had been tortured, murdered, and buried. By the time the search was complete, the remains of 9 victims would be recovered from the house and garden. Additional victims would be found at other locations associated with Fred West. In total, Fred and Rose West were responsible for at least 12 murders, and possibly many more. The case shocked Britain. For weeks, the excavation of 25 Cromwell Street dominated the news. Images of forensic teams digging in the cellar and garden were broadcast around the world. The house became known as the House of Horrors, and Fred and Rose West became synonymous with evil. But who were Fred and Rose West? How had they been able to commit such atrocities for so long without being discovered? And who were the victims, the young women and girls whose lives had been stolen and whose bodies had been buried in the house? The answers to these questions would emerge slowly, as investigators pieced together decades of violence, abuse, and murder. Part 2. The Making of Fred West. To understand how Fred West became a serial killer, we must go back to his beginnings. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, in the village of Much Marcle, Herefordshire, England. Much Marcle was a small, rural village in the countryside, the kind of place where farming was the primary occupation and everyone knew everyone else's business. Fred was the second of 6 children born to Walter and Daisy West. The family lived in a small cottage and struggled financially. Walter worked as a farm laborer, and the family lived a hard-scrabble existence, making do with little. Fred's childhood was marked by poverty, neglect, and according to later accounts, sexual abuse. Fred would later claim that his father had sexually abused his daughters, and that incest was treated as normal within the family. Whether these claims were true or were fabrications meant to explain Fred's later behavior is uncertain, but what is clear is that Fred grew up in an environment that lacked proper boundaries and supervision. Fred attended school but was not a successful student. He was described as slow, somewhat dim-witted, and prone to getting into trouble. He left school at 15 with no qualifications and went to work on local farms, doing manual labor. At the age of 17, Fred was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. He suffered a severe head injury that left him in a coma for several days. When he recovered, family members noted that he seemed different, more aggressive, more impulsive, less able to control his temper. Medical experts have speculated that the head injury may have caused damage to the frontal lobe of Fred's brain, the area responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning. A year later, at 18, Fred was involved in another accident. He fell from a fire escape and again suffered a head injury. This second trauma may have compounded the damage from the first, further impairing Fred's judgment and self-control. Around this time, Fred also began to engage in petty crime. He stole from his employers, took things that did not belong to him, and developed a reputation as someone who could not be trusted. But the crimes were minor, and Fred was not prosecuted. In his late teens, Fred became involved with a young woman named Catherine Renee Costello. Renee was from Scotland and she had come to Gloucestershire looking for work. She was vulnerable, estranged from her family, and involved in petty crime and prostitution. Fred was drawn to her, and the two began a relationship. Renee became pregnant, though the child was not Fred's. Despite this, Fred married her in 1962, and they moved to Scotland to be near Renee's family. The marriage was troubled from the start. Fred was controlling, jealous, and violent. He forced Renee into prostitution, taking the money she earned. He was also sexually deviant, pressuring Renee to participate in group sex and other activities she found degrading. In 1963, Renee gave birth to a daughter, Charmin. Fred treated Charmin as his own, but the child's presence did not stabilize the marriage. In 1964, Renee gave birth to another daughter, Anna Marie, who was Fred's biological child. But by this time, Fred's behavior had become even more erratic and violent. He was physically abusive to Renee, and there were allegations that he had sexually abused young girls in the area. Fred and Renee left Scotland abruptly, moving back to Gloucestershire to escape scrutiny. In Gloucestershire, Fred took work as a laborer and handyman. He was skilled with his hands and could do carpentry, plumbing, and general repairs. But he was also unreliable, prone to lying, and continued to engage in criminal behavior. Fred and Renee's marriage continued to deteriorate. Renee struggled with alcoholism and mental health issues. She left Fred several times, taking the children with her, but always returned. During one of these separations, Fred met a young woman who would change the trajectory of his life. Her name was Rosemary Letts, and together, Fred and Rose would commit some of the most heinous crimes in British history. Part 3. The Making of Rose West. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Barnstaple, Devon, England. Her childhood was marked by violence, abuse, and dysfunction, creating the conditions that would shape her into one of Britain's most notorious female serial killers. Rose's father, William Letts, was a violent, controlling man with a history of mental illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been treated with electroconvulsive therapy. He was physically abusive to his wife, Daisy, and to his children. He ruled the household with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and punishing any perceived disobedience with beatings. Rose's mother, Daisy, was a passive, defeated woman who was unable to protect her children from their father's abuse. She suffered from depression and was often too frightened or too broken to intervene when William turned violent. Rose was the fifth of 7 children. She was a difficult child, prone to tantrums, aggressive toward her siblings, and resistant to authority. Some who knew her as a child described her as strange and unsettling. She had few friends and was often isolated at school. There are indications that Rose may have been sexually abused by her father, though the full extent of the abuse is unclear. What is certain is that Rose grew up in an environment where violence was normalized, where boundaries were non-existent, and where she learned that power and control were achieved through intimidation and cruelty. Rose left school at 15 with no qualifications and began working menial jobs. She was overweight, socially awkward, and had difficulty forming relationships. But she was also sexually precocious, seeking validation and attention through sexual encounters. In 1969, at the age of 15, Rose met Fred West. Fred was 27, more than twice her age. He was married to Renee, though the marriage was falling apart. Fred was immediately attracted to Rose, and he began grooming her, showering her with attention and affection. Rose was drawn to Fred. He was older, experienced, and seemed confident. He made her feel special, desired, and he introduced her to a world of sexual experimentation that both excited and disturbed her. Fred moved Rose into his home, even though he was still married to Renee. Rose took on the role of caretaker for Fred's 2 daughters, Charmaine and Anna Marie. But rather than providing nurturing care, Rose was cruel and abusive to the children. She beat them, starved them, and seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. In 1970, while Fred was serving a short prison sentence for theft, Rose was left alone with Charmaine. 8-year-old Charmaine was a difficult child, traumatized by the instability of her life and the absence of her mother. She defied Rose, talked back, and refused to obey. In June 1971, Charmaine disappeared. When neighbors asked where the girl had gone, Rose said she had gone to live with her mother, Renee. But Charmaine had not gone to live with anyone. Rose had killed her, likely in a fit of rage during one of Charmaine's acts of defiance. Rose either strangled or suffocated the child, and when Fred was released from prison, he helped Rose dispose of the body. Charming was buried beneath the kitchen floor of the house where they were living. Renee, Charming's mother, began asking questions about her daughter's whereabouts. She contacted Fred, demanding to see Charming. Fred lured Renee to a location outside Gloucester, where he killed her. Renee's body was buried in a field, and she was never reported missing. With Renee and Charming both dead, Fred and Rose were free to continue their relationship without interference. In 1972, they married. Rose was 18 years old. Fred was 30. The marriage was not a conventional one. Fred and Rose's relationship was built on a shared interest in sexual deviance, violence, and control. Fred was sexually sadistic, and Rose was a willing participant in his fantasies. The two began to engage in increasingly extreme sexual activities, including bondage, sadomasochism, and the exploitation of other women. Rose also began working as a prostitute, seeing clients in their home, while Fred watched through a peephole he had drilled in the wall. Fred was aroused by watching Rose with other men, and the money Rose earned from prostitution provided additional income for the family. But prostitution and voyeurism were not enough to satisfy Fred and Rose's desires. They wanted more. They wanted complete control over their victims. They wanted to torture, to dominate, to destroy. And so they began to hunt. Part 4: The First Murders. The murders committed by Fred and Rose West began in the early 1970s and continued for nearly 2 decades. The victims were young women and girls, hitchhikers, runaways, lodgers, and in some cases, members of their own family. Fred and Rose's first known victim together was Linda Go, a 20-year-old seamstress who moved into 25 Cromwell Street as a lodger in April 1973. Linda was friendly and outgoing, and she quickly became part of the household, helping to care for Fred and Rose's children. But Linda made a mistake. She caught Fred's attention, and once Fred became fixated on a victim, there was no escape. In April 1973, Linda disappeared. Her parents reported her missing, and they went to 25 Cromwell Street to ask Fred and Rose if they had seen her. Rose answered the door wearing Linda's slippers. She told Linda's parents that their daughter had moved out and had left some of her belongings behind. Linda's parents were suspicious, but they had no evidence of foul play. They contacted the police, but the investigation went nowhere. Linda was an adult, and adults were allowed to come and go as they pleased. In reality, Linda Go was dead. Fred and Rose had abducted her, taken her to the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street and tortured her. They had bound her, gagged her, and subjected her to sexual abuse. And when they were finished, they had killed her. Linda was strangled and her body was dismembered. Fred buried her remains beneath the cellar floor. Linda Go was the first victim buried at 25 Cromwell Street. She would not be the last. In November 1973, Fred and Rose abducted 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper. Carol Ann was a teenager in care, living in a children's home in Worcester. She had been given permission to visit her grandmother in Gloucester for the weekend. On the evening of November 10, Carol Ann left her grandmother's house to catch a bus back to Worcester. She was last seen at a bus stop. Fred and Rose likely picked her up, offering her a ride. Carol Ann was young, vulnerable, and probably grateful for the offer. She had no reason to suspect that the couple in the car were predators. Carol Ann was taken to 25 Cromwell Street, where she was tortured and murdered. Her body was buried in the cellar alongside Linda Go's remains. In December 1973, Fred and Rose killed again. The victim was 21-year-old Lucy Partington, a university student from a middle-class family. Lucy was intelligent, well-educated, and had a bright future ahead of her. On December 27, she visited a friend in Cheltenham and was walking to catch a bus home when she disappeared. Fred and Rose likely offered Lucy a ride. Once she was in the car, she was trapped. Lucy was taken to 25 Cromwell Street, where she endured a week of torture before being killed. Fred later admitted that Lucy had suffered a severe injury during her captivity and that he had been forced to take her to a hospital, claiming she had been in a minor accident. The hospital treated her injury and released her back into Fred's custody, unaware that they were sending her back to her killers. Lucy Partington was murdered, dismembered, and buried in the cellar. Her disappearance devastated her family, who spent decades searching for answers. The murders continued. In April 1974, Fred and Rose killed Therese Siegenthaler, a 21-year-old Swiss student who was hitchhiking through England. Therese was a sociology student at Woolwich Polytechnic in London, and she was on her way to visit friends in Ireland. She was last seen hitchhiking near the town of Leominster, not far from Gloucester. Fred and Rose picked her up, and Therese's fate was sealed. She was taken to 25 Cromwell Street, tortured, murdered, and buried in the cellar. In November 1974, Fred and Rose killed Shirley Hubbard, a 15-year-old girl who was working in a store in Worcester. Shirley was from a troubled background and had been placed in care. On November 14, she left work to visit her boyfriend and was never seen alive again. Fred and Rose abducted Shirley, and she was subjected to horrific torture before being killed. Her body was found with a mask made of tape covering her entire head, with only a small tube inserted in her nose to allow her to breathe. This indicated that Fred and Rose had kept her alive for a period of time, prolonging her suffering. The pattern was becoming clear. Fred and Rose were targeting vulnerable young women and girls, those who were estranged from their families, those who were in care, those who were unlikely to be immediately missed. They would offer the victims a ride, lure them to 25 Cromwell Street, and then imprison them in the cellar. There, the victims would be subjected to torture and sexual abuse. And when Fred and Rose were finished with them, they would be murdered, dismembered, and buried. The cellar at 25 Cromwell Street had been specially modified by Fred. He had dug out areas beneath the floor to create hidden chambers. He had installed soundproofing. He had created a space where screams could not be heard, where victims could be held for days or even weeks without anyone knowing. And the murders continued. Part 5. The VICTIMS REMBRED. Fred and Rose West murdered at least 12 young women and girls. Each of these victims had a name, a life, a family. They were not just statistics. They were people who mattered. And though they died in unimaginable horror, they must be remembered as the individuals they were. 1. unthinkable. Born, approximate year 1949. Died, July 1967. Age, approximately 18 years old. Anna McFall was Fred West's first known victim, killed before he met Rose. Anna was working as a nanny for Fred and Rena's children. She became romantically involved with Fred and became pregnant with his child. When Anna pressured Fred to leave Rena and marry her, Fred killed her. Her body was buried in a field near Much Marcle, and she was not discovered until 1994, after the investigation into 25 Cromwell Street had begun. Anna McFall, we remember you. 2. Charmanny West. Born 1963. Died June 1971. Age 8 years old. Charmin was Fred's stepdaughter, the daughter of his first wife, Rena. Charmin lived with Fred and Rose, and she was subjected to terrible abuse. In 1971, while Fred was in prison, Rose killed Charmin, likely in a fit of rage. Her body was buried beneath the kitchen floor of their previous home. Charmin was just 8 years old. Charmin West, we remember you. 3. Charmanny West. Born 1944. Died 1971. Age 27 years old. Rena was Fred's first wife. After Charmin's murder, Rena began asking questions about her daughter's whereabouts. Fred lured Rena to a remote location and killed her. Her body was buried in a field and was not discovered until 1994. Catherine Renal West, we remember you. 4 Lynda Jough. Born 1953. Died April 1973. Age 20 years old. Linda was a seamstress who moved into 25 Cromwell Street as a lodger. She was friendly, kind, and loved children. Fred and Rose abducted her, tortured her in the cellar, and murdered her. Her body was buried beneath the cellar floor. Linda had dreams of becoming a fashion designer. Linda Go, we remember you. 5 Carol Ann Cooper. Born 1958. Died November 1973. Age 15 years old. Carol Ann was a teenager in care. She was visiting her grandmother in Gloucester when she disappeared. Fred and Rose abducted her, tortured her, and murdered her. Her body was buried in the cellar. Carol Ann was just 15 years old. Carol Ann Cooper, we remember you. 6 Lucy Pierre-Tangetion. Born 1952. Died December 1973, January 1974. Age 21 years old. Lucy was a university student from a middle-class family. She was intelligent, well-educated, and had dreams of becoming a medievalist scholar. Fred and Rose abducted her, held her captive for about a week, and murdered her. Her body was buried in the cellar. Lucy's disappearance devastated her family, and her cousin, author Martin Amis, has written about the impact of her loss. Lucy Partington, we remember you. 7 Thoris Signthaler. Born 1953. Died April 1974. Age 21 years old. Therese was a Swiss sociology student hitchhiking through England. Fred and Rose picked her up, abducted her, and murdered her. Her body was buried in the cellar. Therese's family in Switzerland spent decades not knowing what had happened to her. Therese Signthaler, we remember you. 8 Charlie Born 1959. Died November 1974. Age 15 years old. Shirley was a teenager working in a store in Worcester. She was in care and was trying to build a life for herself. Fred and Rose abducted her, subjected her to horrific torture. Her remains were found with a mask of tape covering her entire head, and murdered her. She was just 15 years old. Shirley Hubbard, we remember you. 9 Juntamott. Born 1957. Died April 1975. Age 18 years old. Juanita was a young woman from a troubled background who had been living in a hostel. She was befriended by Fred and Rose, who offered her lodging. Fred and Rose tortured and murdered her. Her body was buried in the cellar. Juanita Mott, we remember you. 10 Charlie and Robinson. Born 1959. Died 1978. Age 18 years old. Shirley Ann was a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street. She became pregnant with Fred's child. When she told Rose about the pregnancy and expressed a desire for Fred to leave Rose, she sealed her fate. Fred and Rose murdered her. Her body, along with the unborn child, was buried in the garden. Shirley Ann was 8 months pregnant when she died. Shirley Ann Robinson, we remember you. 11 Lisonchambrs. Born 1963. Died September 1979. Age 16 years old. Allison was a teenager from a broken home. She met Fred and Rose and moved into 25 Cromwell Street as a lodger. Fred and Rose tortured and murdered her. Her body was buried in the garden. Allison had hoped to become a nurse. Allison Chambers, we remember you. 12 Heather West. Born 1970. Died June 1987. Age 16 years old. Heather was Fred and Rose's own daughter. She had been sexually abused by her father for years. In 1987, when she was 16, Heather threatened to tell authorities about the abuse. Fred and Rose killed her to silence her. Her body was buried beneath the patio in the garden. It was the search for Heather's remains that led to the discovery of all the other victims. Heather West, we remember you. These young women and girls deserved so much better. They deserved to live, to grow up, to fulfill their potential. Instead, they died in terror and pain, their bodies hidden beneath the floors and in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. We remember them, we honor them, and we insist that their lives mattered. Part 6. The House of Horrors. 25 Cromwell Street was not just a house. It was a carefully constructed prison, a torture chamber, a burial ground. Fred West had spent years modifying the house to suit his and Rose's purposes, creating spaces where victims could be held, abused, and killed without anyone knowing. The house was a 3-story Victorian terraced house in a working-class neighborhood of Gloucester. From the outside, it looked ordinary, but inside, it was a place of nightmares. Fred had converted the cellar into a dungeon. He had dug out areas beneath the floor, creating hidden chambers where bodies could be buried. He had reinforced the walls and installed soundproofing to muffle screams. He had installed hooks and rings in the walls and ceiling, used to restrain victims. The cellar had no windows, and the only way in or out was through a door at the top of a steep staircase. When victims were brought to the cellar, they were imprisoned there. Fred and Rose would bind them, gag them, and subject them to prolonged torture. The torture was both physical and sexual. Victims were beaten, burned, and mutilated. They were raped repeatedly. They were kept in a state of terror, never knowing when the abuse would end or if they would survive. Fred had also modified other parts of the house. He had created hidden spaces beneath the floors where bodies could be buried. He had built a patio in the back garden, beneath which he buried some of the victims. He had designed the house so that evidence of his crimes could be concealed, so that neighbors would not suspect anything was amiss. The house was also home to Fred and Rose's children. Over the years, Rose gave birth to 8 children, and the family lived in chaotic, abusive conditions. The children were subjected to physical and sexual abuse. Fred sexually abused his daughters, and Rose participated in or facilitated much of the abuse. The older children became aware, to varying degrees, that something was terribly wrong in the house. They knew that their father had a special room in the cellar where he took some of the lodgers. They knew that their mother worked as a prostitute and that strange men came and went from the house. They knew that their sister Heather had disappeared and that their parents' explanation did not make sense. But the children were too frightened and too traumatized to speak out. They had been conditioned through years of abuse to keep silent, to protect the family's secrets, to fear the consequences of disobedience. Neighbors also had suspicions. There were reports of screaming coming from the house at night. Lodgers who rented rooms at 25 Cromwell Street sometimes left abruptly, saying they felt uncomfortable or unsafe. But no one reported their concerns to the police. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was less awareness of domestic abuse and less willingness to intervene in what was considered a private family matter. Fred and Rose also maintained a facade of normalcy. Fred worked as a laborer and handyman, and he was known in the neighborhood for his willingness to help with odd jobs. Rose was less well-liked. She was loud, aggressive, and known to have violent outbursts, but she was also a mother to 8 children, and neighbors assumed she was simply overwhelmed and stressed. The West's ability to conceal their crimes for so long was due to several factors. First, their victims were chosen carefully. Most were young women who were estranged from their families, who were living transient lifestyles, who were unlikely to be immediately missed. When these women disappeared, it was easy to assume they had simply moved on. Second, Fred and Rose were skilled at manipulation. They could be charming when they wanted to be. They could present themselves as helpful, friendly, and harmless. They lured victims by offering rides, lodging, or assistance. By the time the victims realized they were in danger, it was too late. Third, the physical structure of the house itself concealed the evidence. The bodies were buried deep beneath the floors and in the garden. The cellar was soundproofed. The house was designed to hide its secrets. But in February 1994, those secrets were finally revealed. The excavation of 25 Cromwell Street uncovered the remains of 9 victims. Additional victims were found at other locations associated with Fred West. The horror of what had happened in the house shocked the nation. After the remains were recovered, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. The site was excavated, cleared, and eventually turned into a pedestrian pathway. The decision to demolish the house was made to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction and to provide some measure of closure to the victims' families. But the memory of what happened at 25 Cromwell Street endures. It is a reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist behind closed doors, of the importance of listening to those who speak out about abuse, and of the need for vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. Part 7. The Investigation. The investigation into Fred and Rose West was one of the most complex and disturbing criminal investigations in British history. It was led by Detective Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Constabulary, a seasoned officer who had worked numerous serious crimes but had never encountered anything like the West case. The investigation began with the search for Heather West. Detective Constable Hazel Savage had been instrumental in building the case, pursuing leads for years despite resistance and skepticism from some of her colleagues. When the search warrant was finally obtained and the excavation began, Savage was vindicated. The discovery of Heather's remains beneath the patio on February 25, 1994, was just the beginning. As forensic teams continued to search the house and garden, they found more remains. Each discovery was carefully documented. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify the victims, using dental records, DNA analysis, and personal effects found with the remains. Fred West was arrested and charged with Heather's murder. Initially, he denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, Fred began to talk. He admitted to killing Heather, and then, in a series of interviews, he began confessing to other murders. Fred's confessions were chilling. He described how he had picked up victims, how he had tortured them in the cellar, how he had killed them and buried them. He spoke about the murders with a disturbing lack of emotion, as if he were discussing routine household maintenance rather than the torture and murder of young women. But Fred insisted that Rose had not been involved. He claimed that all the murders had been his doing, that Rose knew nothing about them. This claim was clearly false. Rose had been present in the house during the murders. Rose had helped dispose of bodies, and Rose had even been responsible for at least one murder charming while Fred was in prison. But Fred was trying to protect Rose, either out of misguided loyalty or because he believed that if he took all the blame, Rose might be spared. The police did not believe Fred's attempt to exonerate Rose. They continued to build a case against her, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, and documenting her involvement in the crimes. Rose was arrested on April 25, 1994, and charged with multiple counts of murder. She denied everything. She claimed that she had been a victim of Fred's abuse, that she had been manipulated and controlled by him, that she had no knowledge of the murders. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Survivors who had been lodgers at 25 Cromwell Street came forward to testify. They described how Rose had participated in the abuse, how she had helped Fred restrain victims, how she had been present during torture sessions. Some described Rose as being even more sadistic than Fred, taking pleasure in inflicting pain. Fred and Rose's own children also provided testimony. They described the abuse they had endured, the atmosphere of terror in the house, and the suspicious disappearances of Heather and others. Their testimony was crucial in establishing Rose's knowledge and involvement. As the investigation expanded, police discovered additional victims. Anna McFall's remains were found in a field near Much Marcle. Renaa West's remains were found in another field. Each discovery added to the tally of victims and confirmed that Fred's killing had begun long before he met Rose. The investigation also revealed the extent of the abuse that had occurred within the West household. Fred's daughters came forward to describe years of sexual abuse. They described how Fred had raped them, how Rose had facilitated the abuse, and how they had been too frightened to seek help. The case became a media sensation. Journalists from around the world descended on Gloucester. The excavation of 25 Cromwell Street was broadcast live on television. The story dominated headlines for months, and the public struggled to comprehend how such horrors could have occurred in an ordinary terraced house in a quiet English city. For the investigators, the case was emotionally devastating. They were dealing with the remains of young women and children who had died in unimaginable pain. They were interviewing survivors who had been traumatized by years of abuse, and they were trying to piece together decades of crimes committed by two of the most depraved individuals in British criminal history. But the investigators persevered. They were determined to bring Fred and Rose West to justice, to honor the victims, and to ensure that the full truth of what had happened at 25 Cromwell Street was revealed. Part 8: Fred West's death. On January 1, 1995, Fred West was found dead in his cell at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. He had hanged himself using strips of bedsheet. He was 53 years old. Fred's suicide came just months before his trial was scheduled to begin. He had been charged with 12 counts of murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He faced the certainty of spending the rest of his life in prison. In the days leading up to his death, Fred had been despondent. He had written letters to Rose, professing his love and insisting that she had not been involved in the murders. He had also written to his children, expressing regret for the pain he had caused them. But there was no genuine remorse in Fred's words, only self-pity and a desire to control the narrative even from prison. Fred's suicide was seen by many as a final act of cowardice. By killing himself, he avoided facing his victims' families in court. He avoided having to listen to the evidence of his crimes being laid out in detail. He avoided the public condemnation and the possibility of being remembered as one of Britain's most notorious killers. But Fred's death also meant that many questions would remain unanswered. How many victims were there really? Where were the other bodies buried? What had motivated Fred to commit such atrocities? Some speculated that Fred killed himself to protect Rose. By dying before the trial, he ensured that he could never be cross-examined about Rose's involvement. He could never be forced to admit that Rose had participated in the murders. In death, Fred maintained the fiction that he alone was responsible. Fred's suicide devastated his children. They had hoped that the trial would provide answers, that Fred would finally tell the truth about what had happened to Heather and the other victims. Instead, they were left with more questions and more pain. The prison authorities faced criticism for failing to prevent Fred's suicide. He had been a high-profile inmate, charged with multiple murders, and should have been under constant observation. An inquiry into the circumstances of his death found that there had been failures in the monitoring of Fred's mental state, and that he should have been placed under more stringent suicide watch. Fred's body was cremated and his ashes were scattered at sea. His family did not want them, and there was no funeral or memorial service. Fred West died as he had lived, alone, unrepentant, and devoid of humanity. With Fred dead, the focus of the investigation shifted entirely to Rose West. She would stand trial alone for the murders committed at 25 Cromwell Street. Part 9: The Trial of Rose West. The trial of Rosemary West began on October 3, 1995, at Winchester Crown Court. Rose was charged with 10 counts of murder, All of the victims found at 25 Cromwell Street, except for Charmin and Renee, as prosecutors believed it would be difficult to prove Rose's involvement in those earlier murders beyond a reasonable doubt. The lead prosecutor was Brian Levison QC, a highly respected barrister who would later become a prominent judge. Levison's task was to prove that Rose West had been an active and willing participant in the torture and murder of young women and girls, and that she was not simply a victim of Fred's abuse, as she claimed. Rose West was defended by Richard Ferguson QC, who faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Rose was overwhelming, and public opinion was firmly against her. Ferguson's strategy was to argue that Rose had been controlled and manipulated by Fred, that she had been too frightened to resist, and that she had no knowledge of the murders. The trial lasted 7 weeks and was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in British history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, members of the victims' families, and members of the public who had secured seats in the gallery. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars of evidence. Physical evidence. Forensic experts testified about the remains found at 25 Cromwell Street. They described how the victims had been tortured, bound with tape and rope, and subjected to horrific abuse before being murdered. The physical evidence made clear that these were not impulsive killings, but carefully planned acts of sadism. Witness testimony. Former lodgers at 25 Cromwell Street testified about Rose's behavior. Caroline Owens, who had been hired as a nanny by the Wests in 1972, described how Fred and Rose had abducted her, taken her to 25 Cromwell Street, and sexually assaulted her. Caroline had managed to escape and had reported the assault to police. Fred and Rose had been charged but had received only a small fine, and Caroline's case had been dismissed as consensual rough sex. Now, more than 20 years later, Caroline's testimony established that Rose had been an active participant in the abduction and abuse of young women. Other witnesses described seeing Rose with some of the victims before they disappeared. They described Rose's violent temper, her cruelty to her children, and her willing participation in Fred's sexual deviance. Fred and Rose's children. The testimony of Fred and Rose's children was devastating. Anna Marie, Fred's daughter from his first marriage, testified about being raped by Fred while Rose held her down. Other children described the atmosphere of terror in the house, the abuse they had endured, and the knowledge that something terrible was happening in the cellar. Rose's own behavior. Prosecutors pointed to Rose's behavior after Fred's death as evidence of her guilt. Rose had shown no remorse, no grief for the victims. She had maintained her innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence, and she had attempted to manipulate her children and others into supporting her version of events. The defense's case was weak. Ferguson argued that Rose had been dominated by Fred, that she had been too frightened to resist, that she had no knowledge of the murders. But this claim was difficult to reconcile with the evidence. Rose had been present in the house during the murders. She had helped dispose of bodies. She had killed Charmin while Fred was in prison. She had participated in the torture of victims like Caroline Owens. Ferguson also attempted to paint Rose as a victim of domestic abuse, arguing that her behavior was the result of years of conditioning and control by Fred. But the prosecution countered this effectively, pointing out that Rose had been violent and sadistic even before meeting Fred, that she had been an active and willing participant in the crimes, and that she had shown no signs of being a coerced or reluctant participant. Rose did not testify in her own defense. Her attorneys advised her that testifying would be too risky, as the prosecution would cross-examine her about her involvement in the crimes and would likely expose inconsistencies in her account. After 7 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The jurors deliberated for more than 30 hours over several days. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as everyone waited for the verdict. On November 22, 1995, the jury returned. Rose West was found guilty on all 10 counts of murder. The verdict was met with relief by the victims' families and by the public. Rose showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She stood in the dock, expressionless, as if the proceedings did not concern her. The judge, Mr. Justice Mantell, sentenced Rose West to life in prison on each count of murder. He recommended that she should never be released, stating, "If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released. You will spend the rest of your life in prison." Rose West was led out of the courtroom and taken to H.M. Prison Durham, where she would begin her life sentence. Part 10. Rose West in prison. Rose West has now been in prison for nearly 30 years. She is incarcerated at H.M. Prison New Hall in West Yorkshire, a women's prison where she is held in a segregated unit for her own protection. Other inmates have attacked her on multiple occasions, and she is universally despised by both prisoners and staff. Rose has never expressed genuine remorse for her crimes. In interviews and in letters to pen pals, she has received thousands of letters from people fascinated by her case. Rose has maintained her innocence. She claims that she had no knowledge of the murders, that Fred was solely responsible, and that she has been wrongly convicted. This claim is contradicted by all the evidence, including the testimony of survivors and her own children. But Rose clings to it, apparently unable or unwilling to confront the reality of what she did. Over the years, Rose has made several attempts to appeal her convictions. Each appeal has been rejected. The evidence against her is overwhelming, and the courts have found no basis for overturning the verdicts. Rose's daily life in prison is monotonous and isolated. She spends most of her time in her cell, where she reads, watches television, and writes letters. She has limited contact with other inmates and is kept separate from the general prison population for her own safety. Rose has had few visitors over the years. Her children have largely disowned her, refusing to maintain contact. Some have spoken publicly about the abuse they endured and about their mother's guilt. They have made clear that they want nothing to do with her. Rose has also been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and articles. Her case continues to fascinate the public, though the fascination is mixed with revulsion. Rose West is seen as one of the most evil women in British history, and her name has become synonymous with depravity and cruelty. Psychologists who have studied Rose's case have debated whether she was a willing and active participant in the crimes, or whether she was coerced by Fred. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the former conclusion. Rose was violent, sadistic, and capable of independent action. She killed Charmin while Fred was in prison, demonstrating that she was capable of murder without Fred's direct involvement. And witnesses described Rose as being an enthusiastic participant in the torture of victims, not a reluctant or frightened bystander. Some experts have suggested that Rose suffers from antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, a profound lack of empathy, an inability to feel genuine guilt or remorse, and a willingness to exploit and harm others for personal gratification. This diagnosis fits the evidence of Rose's behavior both before and after her crimes. Rose West will spend the rest of her life in prison. She is now in her 70s, and she will likely die behind bars. There is no possibility of parole, no chance of release. She will never again be free. Part 11. The Victims Families. The families of Fred and Rose West's victims have endured decades of pain, grief, and trauma. The loss of their loved ones was devastating enough, but the circumstances of the deaths, the torture, the prolonged suffering, the burial in a cellar, made the grief almost unbearable. Many of the families had spent years not knowing what had happened to their daughters and sisters. They had filed missing persons reports, had searched, had held out hope that their loved ones might still be alive. The discovery of the remains at 25 Cromwell Street brought a terrible closure, confirmation that their loved ones were dead, but also the horrific knowledge of how they had died. Lucy Partington's family has been particularly vocal about the impact of her murder. Lucy was from a close-knit, educated family, and her disappearance was devastating. Her mother, Margaret, spent decades searching for Lucy, never giving up hope. When Lucy's remains were finally identified, Margaret was heartbroken but also determined to honor her daughter's memory. Lucy's cousin, the renowned author Martin Amis, has written about the impact of her murder on the family. He has described the anguish of not knowing, the horror of the discovery, and the enduring pain of her loss. Lucy had been a brilliant student with a promising future, and that future was stolen by Fred and Rose West. The families of the other victims have also spoken about their pain. Many have described feeling guilt, wondering if they could have done something to prevent the murders, questioning whether they should have been more vigilant, more protective. This guilt is misplaced. The responsibility for the murders lies solely with Fred and Rose West, but it is a common response among those who have lost loved ones to violence. Some families have also expressed frustration with the criminal justice system and with society's response to the disappearances. Many of the victims were young women who were living on the margins in care homes, working in low-paying jobs, estranged from their families. When they disappeared, their cases were not prioritized. Police assumed they had simply moved on, that they were living transient lifestyles, that they would turn up eventually. This systemic failure to take the disappearances seriously allowed Fred and Rose West to continue killing for years. If the cases had been investigated more thoroughly, if the police had connected the disappearances, if society had valued these young women's lives more highly, some of the victims might have been saved. In the years since the trial, some families have advocated for changes in how missing persons cases are investigated. They have called for better resources, better training, and a greater commitment to taking every disappearance seriously, regardless of the victim's background. The families have also worked to keep the memory of their loved ones alive. They have established memorials, spoken publicly about their daughters and sisters, and ensured that the victims are remembered as people, not just as statistics in a horrific crime. In 1996, a memorial garden was created in Gloucester to honor the victims. The garden, located at a local church, provides a place for families and members of the public to remember those who died. Plaques bear the names of the victims, and the garden serves as a reminder that their lives mattered. The families have also supported each other, forming connections through their shared grief. They have attended commemorative events together, have lobbied for changes in the criminal justice system together, and have provided each other with emotional support. The trauma of losing a loved one to Fred and Rose West is something that never fully heals. The families carry the pain with them every day, but they have also demonstrated remarkable resilience, determination, and love for the victims. They have refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, and they have worked to ensure that the horror of 25 Cromwell Street serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. The case of Fred and Rose West is one of the most horrific in the annals of crime. The murders they committed, the torture, the prolonged suffering, the burial of victims in their own home, represent a level of depravity that is difficult to comprehend. But this case is not just about two evil individuals. It is also about the victims, 12 young women and girls who were stolen from this world, who died in unimaginable pain, who deserved so much better. It is about the families who have endured decades of grief. And it is about the systemic failures that allowed Fred and Rose West to kill for so long without being stopped. The victims of Fred and Rose West must be remembered. They were not just the women buried at 25 Cromwell Street. They were Anna, Charmin, Renee, Linda, Carol Ann, Lucy, Therese, Shirley, Juanita, Shirley Ann, Allison, and Heather. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They had lives, hopes, dreams. They mattered. The case exposed profound failures in how society responds to the disappearances of vulnerable young women. Many of the victims were in care, were estranged from their families, were living on the margins. When they disappeared, their cases were not prioritized. Police assumed they had simply moved on. This systemic indifference allowed Fred and Rose West to continue killing. We must do better. We must take seriously every missing persons report, every disappearance, every victim, regardless of their background or circumstances. We must create systems that protect the vulnerable rather than dismiss them. The case also raises questions about the nature of evil. Fred and Rose West were capable of extraordinary cruelty. They tortured and killed young women and girls, buried them in their home, and continued living ordinary lives as if nothing had happened. How is such evil possible? There are no easy answers. Fred suffered head injuries that may have damaged his brain, but millions of people suffer head injuries without becoming serial killers. Rose grew up in an abusive household, but millions of people grow up in abusive households without becoming murderers. At some point, Fred and Rose made choices: to hurt, to dominate, to kill. And they must be held accountable for those choices. The case also reminds us that evil can exist behind the facade of normalcy. Fred and Rose West were neighbors, parents, members of a community. They looked ordinary. They seemed normal. But behind closed doors, they were monsters. This is a sobering reminder that we must be vigilant, that we must listen when people speak out about abuse, and that we must not assume that normalcy equals safety. Fred West died by suicide in 1995, avoiding justice and taking many secrets to the grave. Rose West is serving life in prison and will never be released, but justice for the victims is incomplete. No punishment can undo the suffering they endured. No sentence can bring them back. What we can do is remember. We can honor the victims by speaking their names, by telling their stories, by ensuring that they are not forgotten. We can work to create a world where such horrors are less likely to occur, where the vulnerable are protected, where those who speak out about abuse are believed and supported. The House of Horrors at 25 Cromwell Street has been demolished. The site is now a pedestrian pathway,